You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. And we are back. And by we, I do not mean the voices in my head. I mean that I have with me the editor and occasional co-host of the podcast, Jana.
Hello.
And Jana, today you are on here because we have some questions.
Yep. What do you want me to say? Aye, Captain.
Yes, exactly. That is the appropriate response. Are you ready, kids, for some Bible questions?
Aye, Captain.
That just sounds drunk.
Aye, Captain.
Perfect. All right, we have our, I'm going to say something like 6th question and response episode here today. We've had a few so far in the past year. It's not an exact science because we had a couple episodes that were combined with other things, and then we had the Israel Q&R that was like 2 episodes. So we're just going to go ahead and say this is our 6th Q&R, and we'll roll with that and don't ask any questions. But if you have not listened to any of our Q&R episodes before, I'll just give you the heads up that we do call them question and response rather than question and answer. And that's very purposeful. I don't ever want to come across like, oh, this is the one answer that you have to have on this topic. Now, at the podcast here, we like to foster open dialogue and learn from other perspectives. So this is not the answer to these questions. It is an answer. It is the response that I have for these. So in all my years of Bible teaching, and it's been a while because the first time I ever taught anything Bible, I was in 5th grade. So I've been teaching Bible for a while. And the questions that come up more than anything else are always related to heaven, hell, and the afterlife. And that's exactly what we've been talking about the last 3 weeks here. We did an episode on hell, and then the last couple weeks have been on heaven. So these are just kind of an amalgamation of the most common questions that I have gotten over the years on heaven and hell. So let's hop right into it.
Our first question is, will people of all time periods be together in eternity?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. You know, a lot of times we just tend to think of ourselves in our own time period, but yeah, being able to interact with other people. And I'll just put this out here up front right now. This goes for all of our questions moving forward. You could come at these from any number of angles. You can look at other religious texts. You can look at personal experience. But I'm just going off of a biblical portrait. Like, what can we get from the Bible on this? Because that's what I'm a nerd about. So just going off of the Bible, this is a hard yes. Yes, people of all time periods will be together in eternity. You don't have to look any further than Jesus. In Matthew 8:11, he said, I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will sit down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. In his parable of the rich man and Lazarus in Luke 16, and I know I may have ticked some people off by calling that a parable, but that's another matter for another day. In his parable, talking about the rich man Lazarus, the Lazarus of that story is depicted as existing alongside Abraham, even though Abraham lived like 2,000 years earlier. On the Mount of Transfiguration, Moses and Elijah both appeared to Jesus, and they were still known as both Moses and Elijah, even though they had lived hundreds of years apart and centuries before Jesus. So, yes, I do fully believe that we would be with different people of different time periods. And going along with what we talked about of eternity being both the new heavens and the new earth, you know, being centered in a society, in a culture, I think that means you could very well see Abraham walking the streets of New York City on the renewed heavens and earth, or Martin Luther King Jr. grabbing lunch in Jerusalem. You know, I definitely think that would be the case. But simple answer aside there, let me now make this a little more complicated, because that's what I do. I'll throw in a few other questions for you to think about alongside that question. What time period will heaven be? There have been how many different time periods throughout thousands upon thousands of years of recorded human history, right? And at this point, practically every decade feels like a different time period. You know, the 2000s were different than the 90s, than the 80s. But every 100 years is a different time period. Or you can broaden that out and say, what about the Renaissance versus, the medieval period versus ancient Rome, ancient Greek? But we have had so many different periods of time that are expressed differently in culture throughout human history. So how does that reflect in eternity? And for example, would Abraham be existing in a future reality that looks something like ours in eternity? Would he have to deal with modern technology? What if it goes the other way? What about those of us who have been here in the 20th and 21st centuries? Do we have to learn like an ancient culture in eternity? And mind you, whenever people talk about this, they pretty much always just mean heaven. Like, nobody seems to assume that hell has a culture, just fire and brimstone. We talked about in the episode on hell why I don't think that's an accurate depiction of it. But what time period, what culture would eternity have? Would it be a previous time? Would it be a current time period, something like we live in now? Or maybe that happens at the end of time? Would it even look like a future one? What happens if humanity goes on for, say, another 1,000 years? And we all have our phones embedded in our brains, and whatever else happens in the future. Is that what eternity is going to look like? It's just whenever human history stops? I've really kind of only heard people have three different conceptions of what heaven would look like time-wise. I think a lot of people have the idea it's going to look something like today. We are what C.S. Lewis would call cultural snobs, or chronological snobs, I think is the term that he used. Basically, we think this is the time we live in, it's the best time, this is what we know, this is how it's going to be. But again, what if human history goes on for another 1,000 years? What's to say ours is anything special? I've also noticed some people seem to have this idea of heaven that's almost like medieval Europe. I've never heard someone actually express it that way, to say, oh, I think heaven's going to look like medieval Europe. But it just kind of comes across in the way they talk about having these, rolling hills with the mansion on the hilltop and Jesus riding in on a white horse sort of thing. I tend to think that's just because of how prevalent the King James has been in our culture. I think it's just people reading older English, like the Middle English of the King James, and reading the whole of the biblical story through that lens. But there is no reason to pick that as a legitimate time period to imagine for eternity any more than any other period. And then I've definitely heard some people that seem to think of heaven or eternity being like Bible times. But that kind of runs into the same issue, because Bible time spans 1,000 years. Are we talking Abraham Bible times or Jesus Bible times? Because there was massive amounts of change in human culture just across those couple 1,000 years there. So it might kind of work from, like, I don't know, an extreme biblical literalist side to try to say, oh, it's just going to look like that. But since we are talking about not an entirely new heaven and earth, but rather a renewed one, what would have to happen to the world as it exists now to go back into a time like that? And we have to remember as well, there have been people who we would call saved as Christians throughout all of this time period of human history. Like, that's going to take up a lot of space eventually. So this may not even be solely limited to this world. There is nothing in the Bible to talk about other worlds or colonizing other planets or anything like that. But you kind of begin to wonder, like, what's going to happen when we run out of space for all of the people in eternity? Or a whole other side of it that sometimes my brain just goes to, and who knows about any of this. But if we consider both space and time together, the space that I am sitting in right now, the space that I am occupying sitting in my chair recording this, I have been in this space before, but we can't overlap times, or else previous me being in this space is going to be in the same place that current me is in, right? I've been in the same space, moved about throughout time. Could it be possible that people who have lived at different times could maybe live in, like, that same time period or that same culture in eternity existing in the same place in eternity, but they don't overlap with the people there because it's showing as a different time. I don't know. That's a weird thought. It's just something that comes to my mind. But, with all of these side questions that I've set up here, let me actually set all of that aside and kind of knock it down with this one question, because that's what I do, right? I feel like, was it Chidi in The Good Place with his 450-page dissertation about this?
Aristotle was Plato's student, and Aristotle believes that your character is voluntary because it's just the result of your actions which are under your control. For example, right now, you have made the insane choice to ignore the person who is literally trying to save you from eternal damnation.
No, yeah, I'm listening. Are we sure we should be paying attention to these guys? It's like, who died and left Aristotle in charge of ethics?
This is the way things are, and then part 2 is, well, all of that could be wrong, and here's why. So all of that being said, does eternity itself even have to be static? Does it have to be that there is only one time period or culture to heaven? Could it be that heaven continues to develop just like our culture today has? Do you get the perfect phone when you get to heaven, or does it continue to update over eternity? And that might be a weird thought for some people, but I actually tend to think that our culture and time as humans, I shouldn't use the word time, since it's eternity being outside of time, but I think our culture could continue to develop throughout eternity. And this is not something I can necessarily prove with Bible or say, oh, here's exactly where that's in the Bible. But I think if we look at the trajectory of the scripture story, that matches. This is where we have to remember that the end of Revelation ties back, it bookends with the very beginning of Genesis. Eden was not perfect. I think we talked about this in our first few episodes on Genesis. I don't remember if I focused on it as much as I would have liked to, but there is nothing in the Bible to say that Eden was perfect. We always talk about the Garden of Eden like it was this perfect paradise. That's never there. Perfect is not the right word for Eden. Potential is. It was a place of extreme potential that we could improve upon and take out into the world. And so then, if that's the case about Eden, and the end of our story at the end of Revelation is a mirror of Eden, or a return to Eden, or even say an improvement on Eden, could it then be that we continue to improve in the renewed Eden, the new heaven and the new earth? And I can't say for sure, but I do tend to think that there will be multiple cultures throughout eternity. It's not just going to be one homogenous thing, and I think it could very well be that the cultures continue to develop and grow even over eternity. So that's just some other thoughts to break your brain a little bit on it, but just for the original question, simple answer, yes, people of all time periods will likely be together in eternity.
Question number 2. What language will we speak?
Yeah, this question is similar to the previous one. I think we can take some of the response from that one and use it to help answer this. So, from the biblical perspective, before the Tower of Babylon story in Genesis 11, humanity was united under one language. The story of Pentecost in Acts 2, just 2 months after Jesus' death and resurrection, reverses the incident in Genesis 11. So just like the end of Revelation is kind of a reversal of the fall and a return to Eden, and I would argue even Jesus' whole ministry and life is meant to be seen as a reversal of the fall, or the failure as we would say here, and a return to Eden, so Pentecost in Acts 2 is a reversal of the Tower of Babylon incident. And that's not something we've talked about much. In fact, I don't think I've mentioned Pentecost at all here on the podcast yet. Part of that might just be where I came from, my background. We were so afraid of anything remotely charismatic that I guess we just assumed that not talking about Pentecost would keep us from being Pentecostals. I don't know. But we pretty much never talked about Pentecost. And that's a shame, because it is a pivot point in the New Testament narrative. And it serves to resolve so much of the tension from the early parts of Genesis. So we'll have to get to that in a future episode. But the idea of Pentecost is where you had 50 days after death and resurrection of Jesus. You had the disciples gathered together, and then you had all of these different people who believed in Yahweh, who had come from the known world at the time, in Jerusalem, and they hear the disciples preaching about Jesus, sharing about this crazy couple of years that they had. And the wacky thing about it is that everybody hears this story in their own languages. We had people who spoke all different languages there at this one time. And this is why it's a reversal of the Tower of Babylon incident, because at the Tower of Babylon we all spoke one language, and then we get split up. And this is now everybody coming from those split up areas back into one location and being united under this message of Jesus. Now, just a little side note for a technicality here. A lot of times we talk about it as being speaking in tongues. Technically, the Pentecost miracle was actually hearing in tongues. I think we kind of get the idea of Pentecost as if you had, well, let's just go with English and Spanish, right? So if you have me speaking English, and let's say I only speak English because my high school Spanish is very rusty by this point. And let's say we have someone who only speaks Spanish right here next to me. If I am trying to talk to them in English, they are not going to understand me. But I think the way a lot of people understand Pentecost would be as if I suddenly started speaking Spanish to them, even though I don't know Spanish. Maybe I should pick a different language, since I at least know a little Spanish. Mandarin Chinese, like, I know none of that. So, suddenly they hear me speaking Mandarin Chinese. But that's not technically accurate. It wasn't that the disciples were speaking all of these other languages. It's that they were then heard in those languages. So it would be me speaking English to that person, but them hearing it in Mandarin Chinese. It's very much like a dubbed over movie. If you ever saw, say, like a Korean movie where all the actors are speaking in a Korean dialect, but it's been dubbed over with English voices, and so the words don't match the lips. That's more the idea of Pentecost. You say, okay, Colin, that's great, but why are you saying all of that right now? Because I think that is an illustration, or at least it could be. I don't think it's necessarily meant to be, but I think it could be an illustration of what it will be like to converse with other people in eternity. Much like with the last question, I can't back this up with saying, oh, here's chapter and verse to say this is 100% what's in the Bible. But personally, I believe that in eternity, we will continue to speak the languages that we do now. We'll just be able to understand each other without needing a translator. We'll have a universal translator built into our brains. God will unlock that part of our brains, and we'll just be able to understand everybody else. It is possible that there could be one language in heaven. That's a perspective that I've definitely heard a lot of people take. I'd say that's actually probably what I think most average Christians would believe, and it's possible. I remember being in Bible college, and the guy who taught Hebrew there for quite a while would always say that Hebrew was the language of heaven. And of course, he would then joke that you should take his Hebrew class so that you can get a leg up on understanding the language in heaven. And the thing is, I think he was actually pretty serious about that. I'm not sure he was entirely joking. Or, of course, you could always go with the people who say French is the language of heaven because, it takes an eternity to learn it. But jokes aside, I don't personally think that God would favor one human language over any other and say this is going to be the language of eternity. Be that Hebrew, French, English, and Klingon, I don't care. I don't think that God would favor any one human language because, and just imagine, let's just hypothetically say English is the language of heaven. Can't you just imagine people who speak English having a little bit of a humility issue in heaven, going, heaven is the language that I spoke in my lifetime. Like, it doesn't feel right. I really doubt that is the way it goes. I tend to think we're all going to speak the languages we are familiar with, and we're just going to understand each other as we talk to each other.
Question number 3. What happens to people who die before the second coming of Jesus and the final judgment?
This one really gets me. I appreciate this one because I don't think this is the sort of question that the average Christian thinks about. So I don't even know who asked this question, but I am going to go out on a limb and say that is probably somebody who really, really tries to study the Bible more than the average person. And I'm also going to go out on a limb and say that you probably came from a dispensational background, because it tends to only be people from dispensationalist circles that care about this kind of question, because it raises an issue for them that doesn't necessarily for everyone else. And if you're listening, scratching your head going, what the heck is he talking about? Here's the 30-second description, which is, knowing me, going to be a lot more than 30 seconds because I can't give a short answer to anything. There are multiple overarching lenses that you can read the Bible through. Just human-made systems that help you understand the overarching story of the Bible. And two of the main ones are called dispensationalism and covenant theology. That's a whole topic that I would really love to spend a couple of podcast episodes on, and I'm hoping to in the future, because it really does deserve that time. But the general idea with dispensationalism is that God has acted differently towards people throughout different dispensations of time, periods of time, groupings of time, ages, whatever you want to call it. And generally, each dispensation comes with a different revelation from God, God giving some new information to humanity. So, like, the best way to understand this is what God expected from Adam is different from what he expected from, say, David. And the general idea is that the more time goes on, the more responsibility people have before God, as we have received more revelation, more information from him as time goes on. And usually this leads up to the period of the cross, as saying that Jesus is the ultimate revelation, and now we are fully accountable before God for our understanding of salvation through Jesus. So usually this whole thing revolves around just the simple question of, what did you need to know to be saved at any given period of time in human history? Again, I'm majorly oversimplifying for time here. Covenant theology is actually very similar to that. Now, I just majorly offended both dispensationalists and covenant theologians with that statement. They would hate that I said that, but honestly, it's true. The systems are not that different. It's just a matter of which lens are they choosing to break up the Bible's history through. And they tend to overlap a lot. Again, please don't stone me if that's something you care about. But covenant theology, rather than focusing on different dispensations, is going to be a little more rigid on focusing on what covenant had God made with humans by that period. So you're going to have, like, possibly an Adamic covenant for Adam. That's way more controversial than it needs to be. But then you'll have, like, the covenant with Noah, covenant with David, covenant with Abraham, covenant through Jesus, the new covenant, the New Testament, we would call it. Here's why all of that matters for this question. The average person in church, thankfully, is not going to hear these sorts of terms brought up. You pretty much only hear about dispensationalism if you are in seminary or some kind of really off-the-wall, like, super fundamentalist church. Most people are not hearing about this sort of thing. And even then, dispensationalism or covenant theology or anything like that, it really tends to only come up in eschatology conversations, stuff about end times, when you're talking about Revelation or maybe Daniel. And dispensationalists are the ones that have created those charts of end time stuff that you see, the stereotypical Tim LaHaye book on end times, and it's got all the charts and the arrows and the colors and the depictions of this or that beast, and this arrow goes to here and then this one goes back to here, and you circle this and draw a line over to here and all that stuff. That's dispensationalism, the stuff that gives you a headache trying to look at the timeline. Dispensationalists have created this general timeline that says before the cross, everyone, good or bad, went to Sheol, which, basically, that's what we talked about in our first episode on the series. Then at the cross, Jesus took the good dead to heaven, or, you could say the justified dead, the righteous dead, the saved, if you will, to heaven, and left the bad dead in the part of Sheol often called hell. Now, you can go listen to the episode on hell and why I don't think that's necessarily a good way to describe it, but regardless, just going with their system here. At the end of time, then, there will be a judgment seat of Christ, where the good dead are judged according to their actions. Usually this is seen to be for rewards, not for salvation. So sanctification rather than salvation. Then there is the millennium, which ends with the great white throne judgment for the unsaved. Again, every single word that I just said can be debated ad nauseum for 1,000 different views. So just roll with it for simplicity's sake right now. The bad dead are then pulled out of Sheol/hell, judged and sent to a somehow worse eternity in the lake of fire. The good dead then move on to the new heavens and the new earth. And it sounds all nice and neat. Now, some of you are going, no, it doesn't. That's super confusing. Well, you're not wrong. But it sounds like a good way to package everything up with a nice bow. The problem is, there is no one passage that says all this. You open up a normal book on the end times that you can pick up off the shelf at a Christian bookstore, and it's going to sound like this nice, neat timeline. But there is no passage that says all of this. What dispensationalists have done is made a patchwork quilt of a lot of different passages that are saying different things for different people in different times and places, and trying to make them all fit together. And they might, or they might not. It would be like if you had recorded everything that I have ever said in my life, and you took a bit out of a conversation with my best friend when I was 10, and a bit of a conversation with my wife from this year, and then another piece of a conversation with a stranger on the bus from 5 years from now, and put those all together and somehow tried to say, this is what Colin believes. Like, okay, maybe what I have believed changed over time. Maybe you need the context of why I said this to that person at that time, and it completely changes the meaning of what I said. This is the danger of ripping things out of context and trying to make one nice linear thing that you can tie a bow around. That's not how the Bible works. And again, this is not an episode on dispensationalism or end time stuff. It's in the pipeline. It's in the future, okay? We're going to get there. No pun intended, that's in the future. I didn't even mean that. Anyway, we run the risk, and I would say cross the line into actually making this mistake. When you do this sort of thing, you are ripping those texts out of their context and trying to make them fit together in ways that they were not necessarily meant to. I don't think that those Bible passages are necessarily a puzzle where you have to find out which piece fits where. It's more like a Venn diagram, where sometimes the circles are going to overlap a little, sometimes the images are going to clash a little bit, and that's okay, because they were directed to different people at different times and different places. It wasn't some big puzzle that we just got more pieces to as time goes on. There is no guarantee that those timelines are completely accurate. And honestly, that whole dispensationalist timeline does form an uncomfortable question that I don't think a lot of people have thought through that hold those views, that there is then an in-between state between now, the life that we're living right now, and the judgment seat in the future. You just think about it. Let's say you have someone who dies today, and, I don't know, humanity goes on to live another 100 years before a return of Jesus. Again, just going from this point of view. What happens to the person in those 100 years? Well, most people would say, oh, they're in heaven with God. Okay, but if the judgment happens before the millennium, which is at the end of time, and the judgment's about the rewards and how you live in eternity, is that person in some sort of limbo where they haven't received their rewards for the next life? Until then, do they have to wait the 100 years until the end of humanity? You start picking this apart, and you realize there's a lot of threads to pull. And then to add on to that, from this viewpoint, hell basically just becomes purgatory. It's a holding place for the ultimate lake of fire, but without the goal of purifying that you actually get in the real doctrine of purgatory. It honestly becomes kind of sadistic when you think about it. The exact timeline of what happens after death is not as clear as a lot of Christians would like to think it is. The Bible is far more concerned with giving you guidance for this life than it is about giving you details for the next. I think a good verse for this kind of conversation is 2 Corinthians 5:8. We are confident, I say, willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. Now, as with anything that Paul writes, there's 100 different ways that discussion can go. But I think this helps us to see that for those who believe in Yahweh, to die is to be with God. I don't necessarily think that there is an in-between state that is expressly stated in the Bible. You're automatically in eternity with God upon the moment of your death. But even then, that doesn't actually answer specifics. There's still a lot of questions that can be asked. And personally, here we go again, this isn't necessarily something I can say, oh, chapter and verse, here's where this is in the Bible. This is just my own personal belief on it. Well, we're on our third question here, and I've said that 3 times, so I'll probably end up saying it again in this episode. But personally, the way I understand this is that if eternity exists outside of time, and all of time is visible from eternity, that would mean that from the perspective of eternity, we are all already dead, right? If eternity is outside of time, so that you can see past, present, future, everything there, then that means, eventually there's going to be a future where I am no longer alive. I am not going to live forever. And if eternity is beyond that, outside of that, that means that from the perspective of eternity, I have already died. It also means that from the perspective of eternity, I haven't been born yet. And from the perspective of eternity, I'm alive right now. You see how if eternity is outside of time, and I think this is how you can say that God is omnipresent. Because if he lives in a reality, a realm outside of time, and can access any point in time, it's not that he is literally everywhere all at once. It's that he can enter the time stream at any point, past, present, or future. So if that's the case, that means that you currently exist in eternity right now. Because if from the perspective of eternity, the future has already happened, and far enough into the future that you and I are dead, then if we're dead, we're in eternity from the Christian point of view. So we are already in eternity. There is a version of us that currently exists in eternity already because it is outside of our time. So my understanding of this, and I know I'm getting way more philosophical with this than I usually do on the podcast, but here's how I understand it. When you die, you are united with the eternal version of you that has already and arguably always been there since eternity is outside of time. So I personally believe that in the moment of death, your consciousness is synced up with the eternal version of you, and that all of those things from within time are now instantaneous and in the past. In other words, at the moment you die, you experience your final verdict and move into eternity after that. You don't have to wait for anything because time doesn't move the same way in eternity. Again, that's not a hill I'm going to die on, but it is the best way I have been able to make sense of such a wacky concept as eternity. And hold all of that in your mind because it's going to actually come into conversation for the last question that we are going to have today. So I realize it's a little bit of a mind bender, but just keep it in the back of your brain as much as you can. I'll do a quick review when we get there. We'll need it at the end.
Question 4. Will you automatically know everything in eternity?
You know, a lot of people assume that we're going to understand everything perfectly as soon as we enter heaven. Kind of like Neo learning Kung Fu in the Matrix, where you just get the quick upload to your brain and then you go, okay, now I know everything about Kung Fu. It's just automatically uploaded into you. But I'm not convinced of that. For one thing, there is no point in the Bible where any of the authors or characters ever say, you're going to know everything in eternity. I think maybe this whole concept comes from the belief that there's so much we don't understand in this life, and so when we get to heaven, it's just all going to make sense, right? We've heard that so many times in songs and sermons, but there's actually nothing in the Bible that says once you get to eternity, everything's going to all make sense. It's nice to think that, and I do tend to think that we will have more knowledge enough that it will explain some things that we don't understand, but there is never a guarantee that you are going to automatically understand everything or ever understand everything. But let's just go with the idea of automatically, like, boom, you're dead, and now you're in heaven, and suddenly, oh yes, I know it all now, everything makes sense. Why? You have all of eternity. Why would you need to know everything immediately? Wouldn't that kind of take away from the whole concept of eternity? Like, you would not need eternity then. You would only need so long before you would get tired of eternity because you know everything. I don't think that's the way God would make it work. I think that would make eternity very exhausting very fast. So why wouldn't God give us the time to learn new things, the ability to continue to learn new things in heaven? Maybe you'll have knowledge of a couple of core things that you've always wanted to know or that really help to complete your story, but I don't think you're suddenly going to know every historical fact that ever happened. Or say you, I don't know, you really wanted to learn about your ancestry and you never got to in this life, or you had a big question about, I don't know, who your grandfather was or something, you never got to meet him. Like, I don't necessarily know that you are immediately going to get that information. You might have to go search it out. Now, I don't think it's going to necessarily be as difficult as it might be in this life, but there is no reason to think we're automatically going to know everything upon the moment of death. And I think I can back that statement up just by looking at the trajectory of how God and Jesus handled people in the biblical story. When Jesus lived here on earth, he didn't automatically explain everything to people. He didn't go, boom, you're here with me now, here's everything you need to know. No, they actually got more confused by his presence there for a while. They really needed time to think through it. When God appeared to Job, he didn't put things in a way that immediately made Job understand everything perfectly. God makes you work for your understanding. I tend to believe that we are still going to have to ask questions and read books and watch movies and learn in eternity. Besides, throughout Scripture, only God is ever said to be all-knowing. I think that implies that we will always have more to learn.
Question 5. How much of human history will you be able to see in eternity?
Yeah, this one kind of ties into the last couple questions as well. And so I'm going to pull again from my whole concept of eternity that I expounded upon a couple questions ago and say that since eternity exists outside of time, I believe that the past, present, and future are all simultaneously accessible in eternity. Think of it almost like having this massive in-ground pool, right? And you have an island in the middle of this pool, just some sort of a raised platform, and say maybe there are a couple seats on there. Again, this is a huge pool, right? So time is that little island in the pool, and the pool itself is eternity. So if you are in the pool, you can come from any direction and climb onto that little island in the middle of the pool. So from eternity, you can just come from any point and get into the time stream. That's how I view it, and that's how I think God is described as I am, because if he is outside of time, if he is in the pool, he can hop into the time stream at any point. So I do tend to think we are going to be able to go back and view moments in time that interested us. And this might just be the historian in me. I've always been a history nerd. I would love to go back and see so many points in history. I think we will be able to. But I imagine it will be less like Back to the Future, where you can influence the past, and much more like, say, Christmas Carol, where they can't see or hear you. Now, if I can get morbidly curious and carry out this thought process a little further than the questioner probably ever wanted me to, what does this do, or what can we say then about private moments that weren't ever meant to be seen by somebody else? Will you be able to go back and see a private conversation? Or where I think this really gets into an awkward conversation is, could you ever from eternity go back to a point and basically like see somebody having sex or something like that? You know, I realize that's probably something that has never crossed most people's minds when they're thinking about this sort of thing. This is the sort of thing that crosses my mind when we ask these questions, okay? Yes, there is something very wrong with me. Personally, going down that rabbit hole, I think just gets way too weird. I can't imagine a way of being able to access time, throughout history where that would be okay. Like, I can't think of any logical reason why that would not be possible, but I just can't imagine that it would be allowed. Like somehow God just builds into our ability to move back in time that there are certain things you just can't go back and see. So again, there is absolutely no way I can point you to a Bible verse and say, here's what the Bible says about how much of human history you're going to be able to see in eternity. The Bible is just not interested in talking about those questions. That's not what the biblical authors had in mind for these stories. But just going off of the general trajectory of Scripture and my own best educated guess, I'm going to say that we can see some things, a lot of things even, but there's probably also going to be some blackout points that we're just not allowed to go back to.
Question 6. Will there be different degrees of suffering in hell / reward in heaven?
Yes, actually. There will be different degrees of suffering in hell and reward in heaven. And that may very well go against what a lot of Christians believe. I know, at least the way that I was raised, we were pretty much taught it's going to be a completely level playing field. Everyone that goes to heaven has the same experience, everyone that goes to hell has the same experience. But that is not at all what's in the Bible. Paul in 1 Corinthians 3, specifically verses 12 to 16, taught that there are differing levels of reward available in heaven. In Matthew 11, 21 to 24, Jesus condemned the towns of Chorazin and Bethsaida for rejecting him, saying that Tyre and Sidon would have a lighter judgment in the final day of judgment than those cities would. And then you can even look at parables like Matthew 25, 14 to 30, that teach a spectrum of rewards. So that's a whole rabbit trail that I would love to get on in the future of the podcast, but we don't really have enough time to today. Just simple answer with it is yes, there are absolutely descriptions of differing degrees of suffering in hell and reward in heaven. Now, the way that this particular question was asked, it's centered around Luke 12, 42 to 49, where Jesus said that some would be beaten with few stripes and others with more. But I'm actually not convinced that that passage is talking about hell. See, if you look in that story, the servants described are servants of the master. And the general understanding of it is that the master is God. So it's talking about how we all face judgment, not just how bad people go to hell, but how all will face judgment before God. Jesus' message was frequently, don't think that just because you believe in Yahweh, you'll be safe from judgment. You can believe in Yahweh, be a servant of the master, if you will, but if you're going around beating down and abusing other servants of God, other images of God, other humans, God is going to give you that same treatment when Judgment Day comes. Yeah, there are a lot of people who I would say rightfully struggle with the idea of quote-unquote Christian forgiveness, and how could we all be in heaven together with people who professed a belief in Jesus, but also caused great hurt and abuse. Like, if you had someone who was an abuser in your life, and then they get saved right before they die, and now do I have to spend eternity with them and be okay with them getting the same thing that I do? No, you do not, by any means. I know a lot of preachers would say, yes, you do, and God will just give you the strength to be okay with it, and your understanding will be changed then. And I call absolute BS on that. There are by far differing rewards and punishments in eternity. And even if you believe in, the traditional simple salvation by grace through faith alone, that does not mean that everybody gets the exact same treatment in eternity. Even if you believe that all it takes is simple faith in Jesus and a lifetime's worth of bad deeds can't pull you down into hell, well, verses like this show that it's not as simple as saying, oh, well, they're blessed in heaven now. Eternity's a big place. And sure, you can say belief in Jesus gets you there into heaven, but what you do with your life determines where on the spectrum of reward and punishment you end up. And sometimes God has to punish his servants when they mistreat other humans. We also have to remember that punishment in the scriptural sense is rarely punitive. It's mainly redemptive. When you have, say, a church discipline situation, depending on your background, you may know exactly what I'm talking about there, or you may have no clue. Coming from a Baptist tradition, we definitely understood church discipline as something that the church was supposed to carry out whenever it thought one of the members went too far astray. Ideally, even in a church that is heavy on a church discipline sort of thing, they would say that the ultimate goal is restoration. That needs to carry over into other areas of thinking too. Now, let me share a sobering thought with you here. How you were parented shapes your view of God. Most of us had parents who punished us punitively. The idea was, you did bad, so I'm going to make you hurt for it so you know how bad it was and you don't do bad again. And then we tend to think that God does the same. But that's not the picture of punishment through most of the Bible. In the Bible, punishment is usually meant to be redemptive, not punitive. And there are passages that speak of saved people passing through fire and stripes and outer darkness and judgment. That's not to necessarily say we all will. Rather, those who believe on God and are safe from hell, if you will, at least from the traditional Christian understanding, are not given a free pass to then act however they want. This is where Paul comes in and says, should we sin that grace may abound? God forbid. May it never be. We will all be held accountable for what we do. You can be in eternity with God and still face periods of judgment. Can I say that again? You can be in eternity with God, what we would call heaven, and still face periods of judgment. Not everyone is going to agree with me here. I get that. But once you actually start to break down who Jesus was talking to in his ministry, and you realize that the majority of people he spoke to already believed in Yahweh, they are what we would call saved, then you cannot get around the uncomfortable fact that he mostly preached judgment to quote-unquote saved people, people who already believed in Yahweh. Since it was before the cross, if they were to die that day, they would go to heaven in the Christian understanding. And yet they are the ones that he preached fiery judgment to, that he talked about having to pass through the fire of judgment. You can't get around that uncomfortable fact. You have to let it sit with you and realize that God's harshest judgment is actually reserved for the saved, and especially for those who are ministers when they misuse their position. So, eternity is a big place. And just because somebody may have believed in Jesus and ended up in heaven does not automatically mean that they get off scot-free for what they did in this life. There are absolutely varying degrees of reward and punishment. And so that fits in as well with the question of like, oh, so you have the person that never heard of Jesus and you have Hitler. Do they get the same punishment in hell? Absolutely not. If Jesus said that it would be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon, and I think in one of the Gospels he even says Sodom and Gomorrah versus Chorazin and Bethsaida in his day, then we can pretty confidently say there are varying degrees of judgment and reward in eternity as well. And you know what? That whole thought process moves us into our next question here. So, Jana, why don't you go ahead and read that one, and we'll just kind of transition right into that.
Question 7. What happens to people who have never heard of Jesus?
Yeah, this is a really important question. In the circles that I came from, a lot of times we would turn to something like Romans 1 and suggest that based on the general revelation of creation and conscience available to every human being, God has given everyone enough resources to acknowledge the existence of a creator. The logic then tended to go that if someone responded to that general revelation, like they've never heard of God, they've never heard of Jesus, they're living in a jungle somewhere, but they look out at creation and think that there has to be a God out there, or they just from their own internal conscience they deduce that there's a God, then God will send them a missionary with the special or specific revelation of the Bible, namely the gospel of Jesus in verbal or written form. And I have heard stories of people in remote places who had never heard of Jesus. They looked out at creation, they prayed to an unknown God, that if he was real, he would send someone to them, and then a missionary shows up shortly thereafter. The skeptic in me wonders how many of those stories are true and how many of them are just there to prove a rhetorical point. But by the same token, I don't want to put God in a box and say that he could not do that. I just don't think that's very often how it happens. However long you believe humanity has been here on Earth, the majority of that time was before the cross. And even if you're taking an extreme young Earth creationist side of, 6,000 years of human history, 4,000 of those were still before the cross. That means that the majority of humanity that has gone to heaven, quote unquote, that has been saved, to use the Christian terminology, has done it without needing to know the specifics about Jesus. Now, while we do live post-cross now, there are many people in the world who still live functionally pre-cross. They have never heard of Jesus and have had no access to a Bible. I tend to think that God deals with those people the same way that he dealt with people before the cross. Abraham didn't have to believe that someone named Jesus would die on a cross. He didn't have access to that information, and God did not hold him accountable for information he didn't have access to. He just had to acknowledge that the world is messed up. He's part of the reason it's messed up, and there's a God who's working with humanity to make it right again. That's all it would have taken. Again, I'm using kind of traditional dispensationalist language because that's just the way the question was worded. So I'm trying to phrase this in a way that would make sense to somebody that would be interested in this sort of question. For people who have never heard of Jesus, I firmly do not believe that God is going to send them to hell just because they didn't know the secret password to get into his heavenly members only club. God isn't trying to send people to hell. I think way too many Christians have this idea that God is sending the majority of people out there to hell, and you just need this, super secret password of Jesus to get into this heavenly members only club, and if you don't get it just right, well, then sorry, pal, you're out. Tough luck. That's a very privileged position to take. That is the sort of position that somebody from within that club already would have for everybody else, because you had access to that information. But I don't think that just because somebody never heard of Jesus or never got the opportunity to get saved, to use that Christian terminology, that God is immediately just going to say, oh, well, sorry, you only had that one shot. Those who end up in hell do so purposefully. They consciously choose to reject God's offer. And that would not apply to people who didn't know there was an offer in the first place. We can absolutely split hairs over how God works in these situations, but I think at very least we should all agree on 2 Peter 3:9, which is often read as God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. A better translation of that verse, at least in my opinion, is God does not want to lose anyone. Rather, he wants to make room for all to change their minds. Can I read that again? God does not want to lose anyone. Rather, he wants to make room for all to change their minds. And if God, who is an extremely powerful being, wants something like that to happen, I believe he can make that happen. God is not bound by some other external eternal force that, oh man, I really wish I could let you into heaven, but you didn't get the password right in your life. Now, I think that if he doesn't want people to be separated from him for eternity, it's going to work out that people are not separated from him for eternity. Now, I do believe that somebody can consciously and consistently reject God, and that God is not going to override their will on that matter. But that's not what we're talking about here. We are talking about somebody who is arguably a good person, and the only difference is that they never heard of Jesus. They never got the opportunity to accept the gospel as presented by a Christian. I do not believe, and I realize this is going to ruffle feathers, I do not believe that person is going to go to hell. I believe that God is going to hold them accountable for what was there in front of them. I do not believe that there is any promise in Scripture that he is going to miraculously send a missionary to every person who has ever wondered if there was something bigger than them out there, because God didn't do that for all of the people before the cross. God is a God of mercy and love, and yes, justice as well. But I think it's not just to suggest that just because someone didn't hear about Jesus in their lifetime, that therefore they are doomed to an eternity in hell. If I were to go over to someone's house and let's say they have a rule that shoes are off as soon as you step in the door, but I have never been there before, and let's just say I wasn't paying attention and noticed all of the shoes at the door and nobody wearing shoes, and I walk up there with shoes, it would not be just for that person to ream me out for not knowing their house rule. Now, if I then know about the rule and continue to do it, sure, it would be just to be corrected for that. But if I was not aware of the rule, if they hadn't told me beforehand, it would not be right for them to get ticked off at me for that, because I didn't know any better. And if we can use this sort of logic for us with humans, our morality should never be stronger than God's. So I think if we use this sort of understanding, we can look at this and very confidently say that God is going to make sure that if somebody wants to be with him in eternity, they are going to. And if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe we should start questioning why you are less willing to see people in heaven than God is. Remember what we said at the end of our episode on hell. It is not our responsibility to determine the attendance list of heaven or the temperature of hell. Even when Jesus walked here on this earth, he is recorded as having said, I have other sheep who are not of this fold. And we are talking about literally the Son of God walking on this earth, and he said, yeah, there are some people here who are okay and they're not following me. They're not walking around being one of my disciples. Like, Jesus is way more inclusive than most of us are. And I think that should give us pause to stop and wonder why we are so taken aback and even frustrated by the thought that there could be more people in heaven than we want to think there are. I think that says more about us than it does about God or the Bible. So again, I realize that's going to offend some people, and it's not the simple black and white answer that some of you were probably hoping for from me, but I don't think the Bible is a simple black and white book on just about any topic, but especially not on this. I don't think it's something as simple as we can say you had to have the super secret password of Jesus to get there. I think God is going to hold people accountable for what they know, and he is going to be harshest with those who knew the most, and he is going to be most lenient, perhaps even more lenient than we would be, or than we think should be, with those who didn't have the same understanding of him that we claim to. And you know what? If that really bothers us, maybe we don't have as high of an understanding of him as we really think that we do. Boy, I can talk for quite a while, but you know what? These are really, really good questions, and I want to give them the appropriate time that they deserve. So I think that we have addressed quite a bit here today that will probably already have your brain going in 1,000 different directions. And we still have a handful more questions to go through here, and I want to give them the time that they deserve as well. So I'm actually going to break this up now. I'm going to end this at this point, but we are not done with the questions yet. So be thinking about everything we talked about this week. Think about some follow-up questions. Remember, you can always send them in to us on our socials, via email, on the website. Reach out any way that you would like. We're also thinking about getting up a chat here soon, probably on something like Telegram or Discord. So if that interests you, reach out, let us know. It can help to expedite the process and let us know if that's something people are interested in or not. But we will hop back on this train next week because we still got some more questions, and these are good ones. We've got stuff like soul sleep in the Bible. We're going to talk about ghosts in the Bible. We're going to talk about resurrection and the people who were raised to life again just to die again in the Bible. We're going to talk about whether or not there's a temple in heaven. That's a big one for some people. And then we're going to address the really tough question of what happens to babies and young children or unborn children when they die. Do they get to go to heaven? What's that going to be like if they didn't get to accept Jesus? All of that stuff, it's going to build on this week. So keep thinking about all of this because it is going to tie into our conversation next week. And as always, until then, most importantly, Jana,
Stay curious and keep asking questions about the uncut and unfiltered Bible.
there we go. See you all next week. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.